Do you hear it? The echoes of the past, the whispers of forgotten truths, fragments of memories lost in the shadows. Welcome to BRAINROT, Echoes, where we bring you stories long buried, unravel mysteries cloaked by time, and guide you through the darkest corners of the mind and the universe. Each video is more than just content. It's an echo resonating deep within, urging you to question, to wonder, to explore. Backend index pointing right, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us in listening to the echoes the world tried to silence. When humans met the cosmos, a Marine and the Galactic Senate. So let me get this straight. The 7-foot-tall crystalline being said, its voice crackling like broken glass through the universal translator. You're telling me that your entire species' diplomatic response to our formal inquiry is one soldier? Staff Sergeant Alex Morrison adjusted his dress blues and looked up at the towering alien with the kind of expression usually reserved for particularly dense recruits. Well, technically I'm a Marine, not a soldier, but yeah, pretty much. The being, whose name was apparently something like crystalline harmony of infinite wisdom and patience, but who'd mercifully told Morrison to just call him Crystal, let out what could only be described as the galactic equivalent of a sigh. It sounded like wind chimes having an existential crisis. "This is unprecedented," Crystal muttered, turning to address the assembled representatives of the Galactic Council. The chamber was impressive, Morrison had to admit. Kind of like the United Nations building if it had been designed by someone who'd eaten way too many psychedelic mushrooms and had access to technology that made physics cry. Representatives from 47 different species sat in a vast amphitheater that defied several laws of geometry. There were the tall, graceful ethereals who looked like elves if elves had decided to become professional ballet dancers, and glow sticks. The bulky, rock-like stone guards who appeared to be having a staring contest with entropy itself. The tentacled mind weavers who were probably psychically discussing how disappointed they were in the universe's latest practical joke. And there, in the center of it all, stood one human Marine who was beginning to think he should have read the briefing packet more carefully. "Look," Morrison said, addressing the room with the kind of confidence that only came from years of dealing with impossible situations and commanding officers who thought logic was optional. "I get that this is weird for you all, but Earth's position is pretty simple. You asked us to explain our concerning military activities and aggressive expansion patterns. So here I am. Consider me your one-stop shop for answering questions about why humans do the things we do." A creature that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a disco ball stood up from the insectoid collective section. "You cannot be serious. We are discussing potential sanctions against your entire species for your reckless behavior in the Kepler sector, and your government sends a single. What did you call it? A Marine again. Technically different from a soldier," Morrison said helpfully. "Marines are the pretty ones." The disco mantis's compound eyes somehow managed to convey skepticism. "And what exactly makes you qualified to speak for your entire species?" Morrison grinned. It wasn't a particularly reassuring expression. "Well, I've been places and done things. Also, I'm apparently the only human stupid enough to volunteer for this job." Actually, that wasn't entirely true. The real story was significantly more complicated and involved Morrison accidentally becoming the closest thing Earth had to an expert on alien relations after a series of events that his commanding officers had classified as need to know, and Morrison stopped telling people about this. It had started 6 months ago when Morrison's unit had been on routine patrol near the edge of human-controlled space. They'd encountered a damaged alien vessel, the first official contact between humans and the wider galactic community, though Morrison was pretty sure the brass had been expecting something like this for years. The ship had belonged to a species called the Vorin, who looked like someone had given a pack of wolves opposable thumbs and a really good education. Their vessel had been attacked by pirates, and they were dying. Now, most species in the galaxy apparently followed a strict protocol when encountering unknown aliens: establish communication, verify intentions, conduct a formal cultural exchange process that could take anywhere from 6 months to several years, and then maybe maybe provide assistance if it aligned with galactic law. Humans, being humans, had looked at the situation and said, "Hey, those guys are bleeding. We should probably help them." Morrison's unit had boarded the alien vessel, provided medical aid, and helped fight off the pirates when they returned. In the process, they'd saved the lives of a Voran diplomatic family who turned out to be pretty important in galactic politics. This had caused what the Galactic Council termed a significant diplomatic incident. The problem, Crystal was explaining to the assembled representatives, is that humans seem to operate without any understanding of proper galactic protocols. They've made first contact with 17 different species in the past 6 months, formed military alliances with 4 of them, started trade relationships with 11, and somehow convinced 3 separate pirate organizations to surrender rather than fight. The surrender thing was actually pretty easy, Morrison interjected. Turns out most pirates aren't really prepared for humans who think impossible odds. It's just Tuesday. A new voice spoke up from the section reserved for the Ethereal Collective. The speaker was tall and graceful, with features that managed to be both alien and somehow familiar. Perhaps you could explain your species' apparent disregard for established diplomatic procedure? Morrison considered this. Well, what exactly is the established procedure when encountering a new species? The proper protocol is to maintain a safe distance, establish basic communication, and then spend several years conducting careful cultural exchanges to ensure compatibility before any meaningful interaction occurs. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. And how long does this usually take? The average first contact process takes approximately 4 to 7 years, depending on the complexity of the species involved. 4 to 7 years, Morrison repeated, like he was trying out the words to see how they tasted, just to figure out if you like each other enough to shake hands. It ensures that both species have time to properly understand each other's cultures, technologies, and intentions before committing to any form of relationship. Morrison looked around the chamber. And how's that working out for you? The ethereal representative tilted their head in what might have been confusion. I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, you've got 47 different species in this room, right? So you've successfully completed the first contact process with 46 other species. How many of them would you actually call friends? There was a long pause. That's not really the point of the process, the ethereal said carefully. Isn't it? Morrison asked. I mean, what's the goal here? To form meaningful relationships with other species, or to have really thorough paperwork? Crystal made that wind chime sound again. The goal is to prevent conflicts and misunderstandings that could lead to war. Okay, fair enough. How many wars have you prevented with this system? Another pause, longer this time. That's not exactly how we measure success, Crystal said. But you do measure it somehow, right? I mean, you must have some kind of metric for whether this is working. Morrison looked around the room. How many wars have there been in the last, say, 100 years? The Stone Guard representative spoke up for the first time, his voice sounding like boulders having a philosophical discussion. There have been approximately 43 major conflicts in the past century. 43 major conflicts among 47 species. Morrison did some quick math. So basically, you've had about 1 war per species per century, give or take. The conflicts were not all. Crystal began. And how many of those were because 2 species didn't understand each other well enough? Morrison continued. The chamber fell quiet. Most of them, the ethereal representative admitted quietly. Morrison nodded. So the system that's supposed to prevent wars through better understanding has resulted in regular wars due to poor understanding. The system is not perfect, Crystal said defensively, but it's better than the alternative, which is chaos. Species making contact without proper preparation, forming alliances based on emotion rather than careful analysis, acting on instinct rather than protocol. Morrison grinned again. You mean like humans do? Exactly like humans do, Crystal said. And it's concerning. The question seemed to catch Crystal off guard. Because it's unpredictable. It's dangerous. It's effective, Morrison suggested. That's not the word I would use. Morrison pulled out a small data pad, a piece of human technology that had apparently caused quite a stir among the galactic community, who were still trying to figure out how humans had developed quantum computing before mastering interstellar travel. Let me share some numbers with you, Morrison said. In the 6 months since humans made first contact with a wider galaxy, we've encountered 23 different species. We formed positive relationships with 21 of them. We've helped resolve 3 ongoing conflicts, prevented 2 wars, established trade relationships that have improved the economic situation for 15 species, and somehow convinced the Raider Coalition to switch from piracy to providing interstellar security services. He looked up from the datapad. Oh, and we've had 0 wars. The chamber was silent. 0 wars, Morrison repeated. In 6 months of apparently reckless, protocol-ignoring, emotion-based diplomacy, humans have had exactly 0 conflicts with alien species. That's impossible, the Disco Mantis started. Yeah, that's what our politicians thought too, Morrison suggested. They kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it turns out that when you approach people, beings with the assumption that they're basically decent and just trying to get by, most of them respond pretty well. The Mindweaver representative spoke for the first time, its voice somehow appearing directly in Morrison's head. Your species' approach is indeed unusual, but correlation does not imply causation. Perhaps you have simply been fortunate. Maybe, Morrison admitted. Or maybe there's something to be said for treating first contact like making a new friend instead of negotiating a corporate merger. Explain. Morrison thought about how to put this in terms that would make sense to beings who had apparently turned diplomacy into a science and somehow made it less effective than just winging it. Okay, imagine you're at a party, he said. You see someone you don't know. The Galactic way seems to be to spend 2 hours researching them from across the room, another hour preparing conversation topics, and then approaching them with a detailed agenda for the interaction. By the time you actually talk to them, they've either left the party or formed meaningful relationships with 3 other people. That's a gross oversimplification, Crystal protested. Is it? Morrison asked. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've turned making friends into a bureaucratic process so complex that most species give up and just stick with the people they already know. Morrison looked around the chamber again. How many of you actually like each other? The question hung in the air like a bad smell. I mean, genuinely like each other, Morrison continued. Not maintain cordial diplomatic relations or engage in mutually beneficial trade agreements. How many of you invite each other over for dinner just because you enjoy each other's company? The silence was deafening. Right? Morrison said. So you've created a system that successfully prevents you from forming meaningful relationships with anyone, and you're concerned that humans are doing it wrong because we actually like the people we meet? The ethereal representative stood up. You're missing the point. The protocols exist for a reason. They prevent misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. Do they? Morrison asked. Because it sounds like they prevent understanding, period. When was the last time any of you had a real conversation with someone from another species? Not a diplomatic exchange or a trade negotiation, but an actual conversation about things that matter to you. Another uncomfortable silence. This is ridiculous, the Disco Mantis buzzed. You cannot reduce interstellar diplomacy to casual social interaction. Why not? Because the stakes are too high. A misunderstanding could lead to war. Morrison nodded. You're right, the stakes are high. That's exactly why you should try to actually understand each other, instead of just managing each other. He walked to the center of the chamber, looking up at the assembled representatives. Let me tell you about the first alien my unit encountered. Commander Vex of the Vorthand Diplomatic Corps. 7 feet tall, looks like a wolf that learned to use a computer, smells like wet leather and ozone. This is hardly relevant, Crystal began. When we found him, he was dying, Morrison continued. His ship was falling apart, his crew was injured, and pirates were coming back to finish the job. According to your protocols, we should have established communication, verified his species' intentions, checked with our superiors, probably formed a committee to study the situation, and then maybe provided assistance if it aligned with proper procedure. Morrison paused. You know what we did instead? What? The ethereal representative asked quietly. We helped him. It was such a simple statement, but it seemed to hit the chamber like a physical force. We didn't check with headquarters, Morrison continued. We didn't run a cultural compatibility analysis. We didn't verify that helping him wouldn't violate some galactic treaty we'd never heard of. We saw someone who needed help, and we helped him. And that's exactly the kind of reckless behavior that concerns us, Crystal said. Why? Because. Crystal struggled for words. Because you didn't consider the consequences. Actually, we did. We considered that if we didn't help, he was going to die. That seemed like a pretty important consequence to us. Morrison looked around the room. Commander Vex is alive today because my unit decided that helping people was more important than following proper procedure. His 3 kids got to see their father come home. His wife didn't become a widow. His crew didn't die in the middle of space while bureaucrats debated whether saving them was diplomatically appropriate. The chamber was quiet now, but it was a different kind of quiet. Less hostile, more thoughtful. And you know what happened after that? Morrison asked. Commander Vex didn't declare war on humanity for violating first contact protocols. He didn't file a complaint with the Galactic Council. He sent a message to his government recommending that the Vorthan Republic establish formal relations with Earth. One positive outcome doesn't justify. The Disco Mantis began. It wasn't just one outcome, Morrison interrupted. The Voran Republic shared the story with their allies. Word got around. Suddenly, we had species reaching out to us instead of the other way around. The Crystalline Confederacy contacted us after hearing that humans had helped the Voran without expecting anything in return. The Void Dancers approached us because they were impressed that we'd risked our lives for strangers. Morrison pulled up another screen on his datapad. The Raider Coalition. The same pirates who attacked Commander Vex's ship. They sent us a message 3 months ago. Want to know what it said? What? Crystal asked, almost despite himself. They wanted to know if we were hiring. The chamber erupted in surprise chatter, or at least the alien equivalent of surprise chatter, which sounded like a symphony orchestra having a nervous breakdown. The Stone Guard representative rumbled. They wanted to know if we were hiring, Morrison repeated. Turns out most pirates aren't actually committed to the piracy lifestyle. They're just people who couldn't find legitimate work that paid well enough to support their families. When they heard about humans paying fair wages for honest work, they figured it was worth a shot. You hired pirates? The Disco Mantis asked incredulously. We hired people who used to be pirates, Morrison corrected. Now, they're security contractors. Turns out people who are good at protecting their own ships from attack are also pretty good at protecting other people's ships from attack. Crystal paused. That's actually fairly logical. Yeah, we thought so too. The crazy thing is it works. Piracy in the Kepler sector is down by 60% since we started the program. Morrison looked around the chamber. See, that's the thing about humans. We tend to assume that most people are basically decent. Even the ones who are doing bad things usually have reasons that make sense to them. If you can address the reasons, you can often solve the problem. But what if you're wrong? The ethereal representative asked. What if the people you're trying to help are genuinely hostile? Morrison shrugged. Then we deal with that too. But it's been our experience that most hostility comes from fear, desperation, or misunderstanding. Address those, and the hostility usually goes away. Most hostility, Crystal emphasized. Not all. No, not all, Morrison agreed. Sometimes you meet someone who's just an asshole. But you don't start with the assumption that everyone's an asshole. You start with the assumption that they're not, and you adjust your approach if necessary. The Mindweaver representative's voice appeared in Morrison's head again. Your species' approach is interesting, but surely you must have protocols for situations where your initial assessment proves incorrect. Of course we do, Morrison said. But our protocols are designed to escalate gradually, not start at maximum paranoia and work backwards. He thought about how to explain this in terms they'd understand. It's like, okay, imagine you're walking down a street and you see someone approaching you. The galactic approach seems to be to immediately assume they might be dangerous, prepare for potential conflict, and interact with them only through a series of carefully structured exchanges designed to minimize risk. That's not entirely inaccurate, Crystal admitted. The human approach is to assume they're probably just walking down the same street you are. Nod, say hello if they seem friendly, and be prepared to defend yourself if they turn out to be hostile. Most of the time they nod back, and everyone goes on with their day. But what if they don't just nod back? The disco mantis asked. Then you deal with that situation when it happens, Morrison said. But you don't treat everyone like a potential threat just because some people might be actual threats. Morrison looked around the chamber, trying to read the alien faces and body language. It was harder than reading humans, obviously, but he was getting better at it. Look, he said, I get why you're concerned. From your perspective, humans showed up and immediately started ignoring all the rules that have kept galactic civilization stable for centuries. But maybe the rules aren't actually keeping things stable. Maybe they're just keeping things static. There's a difference? Crystal asked. Stability means things are working well and don't need to change, Morrison explained. Static means things aren't working well, but nobody's willing to risk changing them. He gestured around the chamber. You've got 47 species represented here, and based on your own numbers, they've fought 43 wars in the past century. That doesn't sound stable to me. That sounds like a system that's not working, but nobody wants to admit it. The Stone Guard representative spoke up. What would you suggest as an alternative? Morrison grinned. Try being friends with each other. That's not a diplomatic strategy. Crystal protested. Isn't it? Morrison asked. I mean, when was the last time you went to war with someone you actually liked? Personal relationships and interstellar politics are completely different things, the ethereal representative said. Are they? Morrison asked. Because from where I'm standing, interstellar politics looks like personal relationships scaled up. You've got groups of people trying to figure out how to coexist, share resources, and resolve conflicts. The only difference is the size of the groups. Morrison pulled up another screen on his datapad. Let me share some more numbers with you. In the past 6 months, human ambassadors have spent an average of 4 hours per week engaged in what our diplomatic corps calls informal cultural exchange. Which is? Crystal asked. Having dinner with their alien counterparts, playing games, sharing stories about their families, talking about their hobbies, complaining about their jobs. You know, normal social interaction. Morrison looked around the room. How much time do your ambassadors spend on informal cultural exchange? Another uncomfortable silence. Our ambassadors maintain professional relationships with their counterparts, the ethereal representative said carefully. Professional relationships, Morrison repeated. Not personal ones. Personal relationships could compromise their objectivity, or personal relationships could give them a reason to work harder to find solutions that work for everyone, Morrison suggested. He looked directly at Crystal. Tell me something. Do you actually like your job? The question seemed to catch Crystal off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Just curious. Do you enjoy being a diplomatic representative? Crystal's crystalline form shifted slightly, creating patterns of light that Morrison was learning to interpret as the alien equivalent of fidgeting. It's an important responsibility. That's not what I asked. It's challenging, sometimes frustrating, but necessary. Morrison nodded. What about before you became a diplomat? What did you want to do when you were young? I don't see how this is relevant. Humor me. Crystal was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. I wanted to be an artist. I created light sculptures. That's cool. Do you still do that? There's no time. Diplomatic responsibilities are quite demanding. Morrison looked around the chamber. Anyone else here doing what they dreamed of doing when they were kids? The silence stretched out long enough to become genuinely awkward. Right, Morrison said. So we got a room full of people who gave up their dreams to spend their lives managing relationships between species that don't actually know each other well enough to have relationships worth managing. That's a rather cynical perspective, the disco mantis said, but there was less conviction in its voice than before. Is it cynical or just accurate? Morrison asked. Look, I'm not trying to insult anyone here. I'm just trying to understand why you created a system that seems designed to prevent the exact kind of relationships that would make your jobs easier and more fulfilling. The Mindweaver representative's voice appeared in his head again. Perhaps you could explain how your species approach would work on a larger scale? Morrison considered this. Okay, let's say you've got 2 species that are having a dispute over mining rights in a particular system. The Galactic approach seems to be to have representatives from both species present their cases to a neutral arbitrator who makes a decision based on established precedent in galactic law. That's a gross oversimplification, but not entirely inaccurate, Crystal said. The human approach would be to get representatives from both species together and say, okay, you both need resources from this system. How can we make this work for everyone? And if they can't reach an agreement, the ethereal representative asked. Then you keep talking until they do, Morrison said. You find out what they really need, not just what they're asking for. You look for creative solutions that address the underlying issues rather than just the surface dispute. That could take a very long time, the Stonegar representative rumbled. Maybe, Morrison admitted, but it's probably faster than the alternative, which is having the dispute escalate into a conflict that takes even longer to resolve and leaves everyone worse off. Morrison looked around the chamber. Plus, if the representatives actually know each other as people, they're more likely to work together to find a solution that works for everyone. You make it sound simple, Crystal said. It's not simple, Morrison admitted. It's actually pretty complicated, but it's the right kind of complicated. What do you mean? Morrison thought about how to explain this. Okay, there are two kinds of complicated. There's the kind of complicated that comes from trying to account for every possible scenario and creating rules to handle all of them. That's what your current system does. It's complicated because it's trying to be comprehensive. And the other kind, the Disco Mantis asked, the other kind is complicated because people are complicated. Every situation is different because every person is different. You can't just apply a standard solution and expect it to work. You have to actually understand the people involved and craft a solution that works for them specifically. Morrison grinned. The first kind of complicated is like trying to solve every possible mathematical equation by creating a really, really big calculator. The second kind is like learning to be a really good mathematician. And you think the second approach is better? Crystal asked. I think the second approach actually works, Morrison said. The first approach gives you the illusion of control, but it doesn't actually solve problems. It just manages them until they become someone else's problem. The chamber fell quiet again. Morrison could almost hear the gears turning in dozens of alien minds as they processed what he'd said. Finally, the ethereal representative spoke. Assuming your approach is as effective as you claim, how would you suggest implementing it on a galactic scale? Morrison was quiet for a moment. This was the big question, the one that would determine whether this whole conversation was just an interesting philosophical discussion or the beginning of something that could actually change how the galaxy worked. Honestly, he said, I think you start small. Pick a few species that are willing to try a different approach. Have their representatives actually get to know each other as people, not just as diplomatic functionaries. When they have disputes, try to resolve them through conversation rather than arbitration. And if it doesn't work, then you try something else, Morrison said. But I think you'll find that it works better than what you're doing now. He looked around the chamber. The thing is, I don't think any of you are happy with the current system. You've all admitted that it's not preventing wars. It's not creating meaningful relationships between species, and it's turning diplomacy into a bureaucratic nightmare that nobody actually enjoys. Morrison paused. So what do you have to lose by trying something different? The chamber was quiet for a long time. Morrison could see the representatives exchanging glances, having whispered conversations, and in the case of the Mind Weavers, probably conducting entire telepathic debates. Finally, Crystal spoke. What you're suggesting would require significant changes to established protocols. Yeah, probably. It would be unprecedented. Most good ideas are. There would be resistance from conservative factions who believe the current system, while imperfect, is preferable to the unknown risks of change. Morrison nodded. There always is. Crystal's form shifted again, the patterns of light becoming more complex. What makes you so confident that your approach would work? Morrison thought about this question. It was a good one, and it deserved an honest answer. I'm not confident it would work, he said finally. I'm confident it's worth trying. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. But sometimes that's all you've got. Morrison looked directly at Crystal. Here's the thing. I've seen what happens when humans try to help instead of trying to manage. I've seen former enemies become allies, pirates become security contractors, and complete strangers risk their lives for each other. I've seen my own species go from being completely unknown to having trade relationships with 15 alien species in 6 months. He paused. Maybe that's not proof that our approach is perfect, but it's proof that it's possible to do better than what you're doing now. The disco mantis stood up. Even if we accepted your premise, implementation would be extremely difficult. The current system has been in place for centuries. It's embedded in our legal frameworks, our cultural expectations, our institutional structures. Yeah, change is hard, Morrison agreed. But you know what's harder? Continuing to do something that isn't working and pretending it's fine. The Mind Weaver representative's voice appeared in Morrison's head again. You speak of risk as if it were inconsequential, but the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. They could be, Morrison admitted. But what are the consequences of not trying? Continuation of the current system, which by your own admission includes regular wars, poor relationships between species, and diplomats who gave up their dreams to manage a system that doesn't actually work. Morrison looked around the chamber. I'm not saying change is risk-free. I'm saying the status quo is also risky. You're just so used to the risks of the current system that you don't notice them anymore. The ethereal representative spoke up. What would you need from us to attempt this experiment? Morrison felt a surge of hope. Just a few species willing to try a different approach. Start with trade disputes or minor territorial issues. Things where the stakes aren't too high. Have your representatives actually spend time together as people, not just as diplomatic functionaries. When problems come up, try to solve them through conversation rather than arbitration. And if it works, then you expand it gradually. You don't have to change everything at once. Crystal's form shifted again. And if it doesn't work? Morrison shrugged. Then you go back to what you were doing before, and at least you'll know you tried. The chamber fell silent again. Morrison could feel the weight of the moment. He was just one human in a room full of aliens, but somehow he'd managed to get them to seriously consider changing a system that had been in place for centuries. It was either going to be the most successful diplomatic mission in human history or the most spectacular failure. Possibly both. Finally, the Stone Guard representative spoke. I am willing to participate in this experiment. Morrison blinked. He'd been prepared for a lot of responses, but immediate agreement wasn't one of them. You are? Crystal asked, sounding as surprised as Morrison felt. The current system has not prevented the conflicts that have ravaged my people's mining colonies, the Stone Guard rumbled. Perhaps it is time to try something new. The ethereal representative stood up. The ethereal collective would also be willing to participate on a limited basis. As with the insectoid collective, the disco mantis buzzed, though we reserve the right to withdraw if the experiment proves unsuccessful. Morrison looked around the chamber, watching as more and more representatives stood up. Not all of them. There were still plenty of skeptics, but enough to make this work. Well, he said, grinning widely, I guess we're doing this. Crystal's form had taken on a pattern that Morrison was learning to interpret as cautious optimism. This is highly irregular. Yeah, but you know what? I'm starting to think irregular might be exactly what you need. Morrison looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. So, who wants to have dinner? The question hung in the air for a moment, and then something remarkable happened. The disco mantis started making a sound that Morrison realized was laughter. The ethereal representative smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both alien and completely familiar. Even the Stone Guard's rocky features shifted into what might have been amusement. You know what? Crystal said, his voice taking on a tone Morrison had never heard before, something that sounded almost like excitement. I think I'd like that. 6 months later, Morrison sat in the same chamber, wearing the same dress blues, but everything else had changed. The formal seating arrangement had been replaced with smaller, more intimate groupings. Representatives were actually talking to each other instead of just delivering prepared statements. There was laughter echoing through the space. Actual laughter from beings who had spent centuries treating diplomacy like a funeral service. Status report, Crystal said, settling into the chair next to Morrison. The crystalline being had taken to wearing what he called his casual configuration, patterns of light that were apparently the alien equivalent of jeans and a t-shirt. Morrison pulled up his datapad. Let's see. Trade disputes are down 70%, military conflicts are down 85%, and we've had exactly 0 wars in the past 6 months. 0 wars, Crystal repeated, shaking his head in amazement. Who would have thought that actually liking each other would be more effective than carefully managed professional relationships? Yeah, it's crazy how that works out, Morrison said dryly. Across the chamber, he could see Commander Vex of the Vorthan Republic engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate with a Mindweaver representative about the best way to prepare some kind of alien seafood. The ethereal ambassador was teaching a group of stone guards some kind of meditation technique. The former pirate captain, who was now head of interstellar security, was arm wrestling with a disco mantis. It looked like chaos. It was chaos in the best possible way. Morrison, Crystal said quietly, I have something to tell you. Yeah, I've started making light sculptures again. Morrison smiled. That's great. Are they any good? Crystal's form shifted into what Morrison had learned was the alien equivalent of a blush. They're terrible, but I'm enjoying them. That's the important part. Crystal nodded, then looked around the chamber. You know, when Earth first sent you here, I thought your government was either incredibly arrogant or completely insane. What do you think now? Crystal considered this. I think they were both. And I think that's exactly what we needed. Morrison looked around the chamber at the representatives from 47 different species who had somehow managed to become friends, despite centuries of protocol designed to prevent exactly that from happening. Yeah, he said, I think you're right. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Morrison made a mental note to send a message to his commanding officer. Mission accomplished. Recommend sending more Marines to future diplomatic functions. These aliens are all right. But that was a conversation for another day. Right now, he had a dinner invitation from a 7-foot-tall crystalline being who made light sculptures, and Morrison was pretty sure that was exactly the kind of ridiculous situation that made this job worthwhile. After all, someone had to teach these aliens how to have fun. Might as well be the Marines.